everybody. I'm going to introduce you to a concept today called the rhetorical triangle. Let me spell that out for you. We're going to be using this concept quite a bit in this class, and today was the day that we were going to start talking about it. So I'm going to talk about it a little bit in a video so that you have the concepts. Basically, the rhetorical triangle is a concept that allows you to take any piece of essay writing, essentially, and break it down into a triangle. Now, at the top of the triangle, we have the author and / persona. You'll actually have both author and persona in the same piece of writing, but we'll talk about why that is in just a minute. In the bottom left corner, you have the audience, and in the bottom right corner, you have the topic or the content. Now, in the center of the triangle is the purpose and intent, and all of these things are supposed to be working together towards the purpose and intent. So the author creates perhaps a persona in order to fulfill the purpose and intent in discussing this topic to a specific audience. Okay, that's the basic idea. Now let's talk about how this works with a specific essay, like the essay that we read for our writing sample. So let's go over to Be a Gamer, Save the World. Now we have an author. The author, it's very simple, right? It's Jane McGonigal. So let's find out a little bit more about Jane McGonigal, because when we talk about author, we're not just talking about who it is, we're also talking about this person's authority in discussing the topic and so on. Okay, so who is Jane McGonigal? Well, we can find out a little bit about that by just kind of looking in the essay itself, or at the bottom of the essay. It tells us at the bottom of the essay that McGonigal is the Director of Game Research and Development at the Institute of the Future. Now, a number of you did bring up ideas about McGonigal and her work when you did discuss her essay in your writing samples. So, you know, what we have here is a little bit of information about her credentials, okay? And the essay is adapted from a book she published, Reality is Broken, published by, incidentally, Penguin Press, which is a pretty reputable publisher. So we already know that this is adapted from a book. We know that she, in other words, is a book writer, and that she's a book writer with a book deal with Penguin Press, which is a reputable publishing house. Okay, so that's a little bit of information that we know. I don't know right now that much about the Institute for the Future unless I look online. You know, I might look on Google if I want to know more about that. But we're not really doing an in-depth discussion of Jane McGonigal. We're just trying to get a basic overview here. So we probably don't need to look up details about the Institute for the Future unless we were actually writing an essay on this particular piece. Okay, so we have some information now about the author. We'll come back to the persona in just a little while. Let's talk about the audience. Oh, and by the way, there was one other thing. You can also find, I'm sorry to be backtracking, but you can also find information about the author in the essay itself. For example, right here, she says, my research over the past decade at the University of California, Berkeley, and the Institute for the Future has shown. Okay, so this is her research. She's conducted it at UC Berkeley and at the Institute for the Future. So we know that her background includes academia as well as this institute. Okay, so let's come back to the audience now, okay? This part is a little bit tricky for students because students frequently speculate on what the audience is. You know, it's like, oh, well, she wrote it for everybody. Well, actually, she wrote the original publication for everybody, probably, in a book. But this particular version, this adaptation, was published somewhere. And that's what we want to think about in terms of who's the audience for this essay. So where was it published? Well, we actually have a little footnote here, which links down here. And we can see that this was originally published, this essay version of it was published in the Wall Street Journal in 2011. Okay. We got it from the web on this particular date, so that's the access date, but you guys already know that stuff from doing MLA. At any rate, this was originally published in the Wall Street Journal, so the target audience for this particular essay version of her work was the audience that reads the Wall Street Journal. Now, who is that audience? Okay, that's the question that you would want to ask yourself. Who is that audience? Who's the audience for this publication? Okay, and the audience for the Wall Street Journal is people who are interested in business, first and foremost. So why would this particular essay be published in a newspaper that is primarily focused on business? You know, that would be a question that you would ask. Why that audience? Why would that audience be interested in this topic? Okay, so, and what is she doing in this essay to try to reach that audience? Okay, so we have a little bit of information here about McGonigal. We have information about where this was published. By the way, the Wall Street Journal also has a somewhat conservative editorial slant. Now, by conservative, I'm talking about in terms of foreign policy. You know, they tend to, you know, approve of U.S. intervention and so on in various foreign countries. So that's probably not incredibly relevant here, but the Wall Street Journal has a business focus and a somewhat conservative editorial slant. Okay, so let's move on to the topic and the content. We actually talked a little bit about the topic and content when we discussed audience. So for the topic and content here, obviously this is about video games. And why would this audience be interested in hearing about video games? Okay, so that's one of the things that you would be thinking about in terms of this rhetorical triangle. Now, the purpose and intent. And most of you grasped this in dealing with your essays. Some people never quite got to the end of the essay to discuss her real main points. But the basic idea behind this essay, her purpose and intent, is to try to convince this audience that video games are not, as she mentions at the beginning, a waste of time. Okay? In fact, they are very nearly the opposite, according to Jane McGonigal. Okay? And her idea, her purpose and intent is to try to convince this audience that there are actual real-world possibilities for games. That game design can be used as a way to create possible means of solving diseases and of actually dealing with issues like hunger and other, you know, social issues. So basically her purpose here is not just to talk about games being an escapism and stress reliever, etc., etc. It's to talk about the potential that game design has, not necessarily games, but game design has for creating a means into finding real-world solutions to real-world problems. So that's what she actually means with this title, Be a Gamer, Save the World. So that's her purpose and her intent. And everything in the essay should be working together to try to fulfill that purpose and intent. That's what we, do in the rhetorical triangle. So for example, at the beginning of the essay, when she stipulates to her audience that, yeah, a lot of people see this as a waste of time, okay? She's basically putting that out there right from the very start. And then she kind of deconstructs that idea. So basically, McGonigal is trying to present this idea to an audience that is comprised largely of people who would be interested in business implications, okay? And it's an idea about video games, something that many of them might think is a waste of time. So consider the choices that she makes in presenting this argument as being choices that she's making to present it to a specific audience. Okay? Now, in terms of persona, sometimes every author is using some sort of persona, whether it's an obvious persona or a not so obvious persona. Okay? Persona is not necessarily a fictional creation. It may just be a glimpse of who the person is, okay, and a slant on who the person is. So, for example, you have Jonathan Swift in A Modest Proposal, whose persona is actually a character, okay? He's the author, but the voice of the essay is written in this persona who's actually a character who is not Jonathan Swift. Jane McGonigal's not doing that, okay? Her persona is not somebody that she's not. It's somebody who's excited about games. So part of her persona is a person who's very enthusiastic about games, but she's also trying to show you her credentials. So she, presents this evidence and so on, from various studies to, and even gives you a bar graph at one point, to try to create a persona of a game designer and game theorist who can actually talk to an audience of Wall Street Journal readers. Okay, she's making those choices. So at any rate, those are the basics of the rhetorical triangle, and we're going to be applying the rhetorical triangle in a lot of different contexts in the next few weeks. So I wanted to give you the basics of it right now, and hopefully that will be, helpful as we move on into our assignments.